Ми тепер будемо слухати до другого доповідача, Томас Prymak, історик і дослідник при кафедрі українознавства тут при Торонському університеті, автор книг про Грушевського, Костомарова і українців в Канаді. Будь ласка. Він буде доповідати на тему Ukrainian DP Folklore, a Neglected Legacy.
And I'll speak in English. It's my native language. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be speaking about Ukrainian DP folklore, and I call it a neglected legacy because there's practically no scholarly work on the subject whatsoever in any language that I know of. So the study of Ukrainian folklore in North America has long been dominated by books and articles describing the heritage of the great economic immigration to the Americas, which occurred before the First World War. In general, almost all of this writing about immigrant folklore, works by Yaroslav Rudnitsky, Robert Klimash, and others, has been concentrated on the pioneer immigration to the Canadian prairies, which occurred before 1914, with very little attention paid to a Ukrainian American folklore from that period. On Ukrainian folklore of later times, that is the interwar period of the 20th century, and the period of the political refugees, the DPs, displaced persons, after 1945, so far as I can tell, very little scholarship exists for either American or Canadian developments. This is a great shame. For even to the casual observer, not only does DP folklore differ greatly from the relatively well-studied Ukrainian folklore of the pioneer period on the prairies, but it contains many gems unique to itself. These treasures generally reflect a different stage in the history of the Ukrainian people, a different kind of emigration experience, a different destiny in the lands of settlement. That is to say, for the most part, the Ukrainian DPs emigrated after and not before the spread of national consciousness across the countryside of western and to some extent eastern Ukraine, left their ancestral homeland primarily for political and not economic reasons, and settled mostly in the various cities of North America, especially in the east, and not on farms in the west, as had the pioneers. Thus, in a sense, it was quite natural that DP folklore should be overlooked to some extent by the professional folklorists of the 1950s and 1960s. For these folklorists, to some degree at least, upheld a long tradition of leaving the cities and going into the countryside to collect the vestiges of a swiftly vanishing folk culture believed to have been better preserved in the rural setting rather than in the urban one. Indeed, I suspect that the very concept of urban legend, now so well developed in Western countries, was largely absent in Slavic folklore studies right up until the final collapse of communism in the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 1990s. At any rate, a personal story is relevant here. Although I had gotten to know something of Ukrainian DP culture in Winnipeg, where I was raised and went through the first stages of my education, some of my more important experiences with this culture occurred when in the mid-1970s I first moved from Western Canada to the great Eastern Canadian metropolis of Toronto. I came to do Slavonic studies and Ukrainian history at the University of Toronto, and in most of my classes there was a respectable contingent of Ukrainian Canadians, some of them sons and daughters of the DP immigration. A great many of these have settled in Toronto. In my first year Russian class, there was a girl named Oksana with whom I became friends. She was the daughter of DP immigrants and taught me a verse which I had never heard before. It went like this: "В России хорошо, але їсти нічого. Не крови, не швині, тільки Stalin на стіні." And I translate this verse with some poetic license thus: in Russia, everything's fine, but there's no food, no wine, no cattle, no pork at all, only Stalin up on the wall. This verse, I feel, is an excellent introduction to Ukrainian DP folklore. In 4 short lines, it describes the complex political experience the DPs found themselves in before leaving Europe. This quaint mixture of Ukrainian and Russian languages, folklorists call it macaronic verse, encapsulates the contrasting totalitarian political propaganda, and the dismal economic reality of Soviet Russia, as seen by the country folk and rural intelligentsia of Western Ukraine before 1945. The war of 1939 to 45, of course, with its alternating communist, Nazi, and repeat communist occupations, was the formative experience of most of these DPs. The tremendous shock of communist and Nazi occupations of Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine, or Galicia as this region was once called, is evident in the indelible impression it made on the population. Some 33 years after hearing that first verse from Oksana, that is in the summer of 2008, again in Toronto, I ran into a slightly different former refugee from Galicia. He was an 85-year-old man named Francesek, of rural Polish origin from the Ternopil area, who spoke to me in a quaint mixture of Ukrainian laced with a bit of Polish and Russian. He was taken as a forced laborer to Germany and loved to tell stories about his wartime experiences, which had been difficult but not crushing. One day he recited to me a verse which almost exactly paralleled that of Oksana, but zeroed in on life on the collective farm, or kolkhoz as it is called. The verse went, Tato imamo v kolkhozi, a dite bihayut po morozi. Nema hliba, nema sala, bo sovietska vlast nastala, which I translate thus. Father and mother are on the kolkhoz, while their children run about in the frost. There is no bread and there is no fat. Comes Soviet rule, and that is that. In another, even crisper verse, the same informant, like Oksana before me, where was I? Oh yes. In another, even crisper verse, the same informant, like Oksana before him, addressed the great leader Stalin and alluded to the general squalor of life under the Soviets. Batko Stalin, daj nam milo, Bože voši majo krila. Once again, with some poetic license, I translate thus. Father Stalin, give us soap, because the lice take away our hope. So much for communist propaganda and the good life on the collective farm, and the great virtues and achievements of Comrade Stalin. I should note, however, that though my warm-hearted and somewhat jolly Toronto informant, the elderly Galician laborer, Ukrainian-speaking Francesek, had been a forced worker on a farm in Bavaria, he had no funny verses to tell about the Nazis. Moreover, though after the end of the war, he became aware of the horrifying German concentration camps, one of which he now visited and witnessed firsthand, and which made an indelible impression upon him, he displayed absolutely no animus against the German farmer for whom he had worked, and even tried to get in touch with the surviving family many years after the war had ended. Folklore, of course, takes on many forms. Songs, stories, proverbs, legends, jokes, riddles, children's games, and other genres as well. But in my humble opinion, with the possible exception of proverbs, folk songs seem to be its epitome. In my search for materials on DP folklore, I found only one book which dealt with several of these forms. This book was titled Ukrainska narodna tvorchist, which can be translated literally as Ukrainian popular creativity, or more loosely as Ukrainian folklore. It was compiled by Dmytro Kulay and published in Toronto in 1986 by Homen Ukraina, the Canadian newspaper of the Bandera wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the DP newspaper in Canada par excellence. When I picked up this book, I immediately turned to the pages concerning folk songs dealing with the immigration theme. I did not know what to expect, but I did know that the songs appearing in this collection would be somewhat different from those of the relatively well-studied Ukrainian pioneers. These early songs often have a sad and melancholic tone, reflecting the hard experience of immigrant life on the frozen prairie at the beginning of the 20th century. They speak of hardship in the old country, stary kraj, and disappointment and loneliness in the new land. Then they proceed to adaptation and eventually success in the new country, Novy kraj. They mention Galicia, Bukovina, Ruthenians and Ruthenian people, Ruski narod, but hardly, if ever, talk about Ukraine or Ukrainians. The tone and vocabulary of DP verse is completely different. Most of the verse compiled by Houlet seems to have been collected from all eras, is much more positive and optimistic than that of the pioneer verse collected by Rudnitsky and Klimash. Moreover, the old country and new country terms are systematically replaced by the term Ukraine and the name Canada, while the term Ruthenian, Ruski, is replaced by the term Ukrainian, Ukrainsky. In one of these verses, which probably relates to the interwar period, but certainly suits the tenor of the DP period, the immigrant tells how he came to Canada and tried to make some money but found it very difficult. He eventually succeeds and thinks to return home, but politics stand in the way. The verse is sung something like a Kolomeyka style. Zarobil я трохи гроші, та й собі думаю, поїхав би в Україну, держави не маю, бо забрали Україну ріжні окупанти, працюють далі у Канаді бідні емігранти. Бо Канада вільний край і добрий лад мати, віруй Богу, працю щиро, ти будеш це мати. And these lines I translate thus. And when I had earned a little cash, the thought occurred to take this stash and return to Ukraine right away. But no country have I, and so I stay. For Ukraine has been taken, occupied, forsaken. So in Canada, work right on to this poor immigrant song. But Canada is a very free land, good like a mother at your right hand. Believe in God, work on well. You'll have it all, and life will be swell. These verses seem to originate from the period after the unsuccessful Ukrainian struggle for independence following the First World War. This liberation struggle, Vyzvolne Zmagання, as it was usually called by the immigrants, ended in the partition of newborn Ukraine by its aggressive neighbors, for the most part Poland and Soviet Russia, but also Romania and Czechoslovakia. This may account for the reference in the verse to various occupiers, Rīžņi okupanti, a phrase that was totally unknown before 1914. Alternatively, though in my opinion somewhat less likely, largely because of the reference in the preceding lines to a return to Ukraine after making some money, occupiers might refer to the annexation of Western Ukraine by the Soviet Union in 1944. However, whatever its origins, the very fact that this verse lived on into the post-45 period and is included in a compilation of Ukrainian folklore published in 1986 by a dedicated DP justifies its classification as a piece of DP folklore. Of course, besides folk songs, many other genres of folklore existed during this period, and Houlet includes most of them in the volume. The book begins with proverbs and maxims, goes to stories and jokes, and only ends with immigrant folk songs, carols, and old country folk songs. Of all these, however, it seems to me that the most characteristic genre of the DP period is the political joke, a new form of folklore that was largely unknown to both the pioneer and interwar periods, but becoming very widespread during the era of extravagant totalitarian claims and propaganda. Earlier scholars like Robert Klimash, who collected most of his material in the 1960s on the prairies, examined jokes in some of their works, but these were jokes about Ukrainians at their own expense. They were mostly of the so-called numbskull variety, almost identical to the Polish jokes once told in the United States, or the Newfie jokes of central Canada. These Ukrainian jokes were geographically restricted to Western Canada, the heartland of the old economic immigration. I at one time asked my good friend Roman Senkus, a Ukrainian friend in Toronto, a dedicated and very active son of the DP immigration, if he ever had heard such jokes, and he replied to me that he had not. That Ukrainian friend in Toronto had, however, heard many of those Polish jokes, and I myself, at the beginning of my residence in Toronto, heard an occasional Newfie joke, some of which were eventually put into various anthologies of Canadian humor. Of the latter, there is one that especially appeals to the university-educated and students of the arts. And since an example is necessary, I shall repeat this one, which has a special twist to it and can be interpreted in more than one way. It goes like this. There was a famous bookstore in St. John's, and one day a good citizen of that fair city came in to see what was on offer. The Newfie bookseller politely said to him, "Good day, what can I help you with?" The customer answered, "I am looking for a book by Shakespeare." The bookseller then asked, "Which one?" The customer replied, "William." Of course, cultural context is very important to the rise and fall of jokes. And this context determines whether there will be or will not be jokes about any specific group. My example of an ethnic joke, if we can call it that, comes from a respected published anthology and would probably not be told in less educated circles, where literature is less appreciated. But many of these ethnic jokes, especially those of the numbskull type, can be quite crude, unrepeatable here, and are sure to cause offense in some quarters. Nevertheless, at least one scholar, Christy Davies, who wrote 2 books on the subject, argues that various hostilities and prejudices arising from ethnic conflicts, and for certain other reasons, are not the cause of joking. In his book, The Mirth of Nations, in which he devotes 50 pages to the Polish jokes once told in the United States, claims that socially and geographically marginal peoples, but nevertheless accepted peoples, are the ones who are joked about. He states that, and I'll just summarize because I don't have much time. He states that Polish jokes, for example, only arose in the United States in the 1960s. Anti-Polish prejudice in the United States was strongest before 1939, 1940, 1941, when Poland very suddenly became an ally of the Americans. So it's not, they don't go together. Anti-ethnic prejudice and joking of these types do not always go together. And the same thing is true for the Ukrainian jokes in Canada. But the political jokes of the DPs were quite different from all of this. They were never put down on the Ukrainians themselves, but rather a satirical criticism of their political enemies, the Soviet Union, communism, and the Russians. One typical joke goes like this. Soviet leader Khrushchev was ready to enter an agreement concerning Berlin, but set one condition. The Western countries had to acknowledge that Adam and Eve had been Russian. Kennedy and Macmillan hesitated. De Gaulle of France opposed it. Finally, they asked the West German Chancellor Adenauer. Adenauer agreed with Khrushchev and considered his claim to be valid. He said, "It is true. Adam and Eve were really Russians. They came into the world poor. They had nothing to wear and believed all the time they were living in paradise." I get a few minutes for the laughter. This joke, somewhat like the verses quoted at the beginning of this article, cleverly juxtaposes communist propaganda and Russian poverty. It also ridicules the supposed Russian tendency to claim that the Russians themselves invented everything of great import. A second example is rather more delicate. Goulet gives it the title, A Diplomatic Explanation. During one of the recurrent purges of the Communist Party apparatus, a bureaucrat was asked his opinion of Soviet rule. "Well, it is the same as my attitude towards my wife," cautiously answered the apparatchik. "How is that?" inquired one member of the investigative commission, who was somewhat surprised at the response. "Well," replied the apparatchik, "I love it a little, I fear it a little, and I'd like to exchange it for another a little." Now, I'm going to skip another section because I have no time and go on to the very end. Of course, after 1991, communist ideology collapsed all over the world together with the Soviet Union. As an ideological rival of the democratic West, however, it was replaced in part by the newer movement towards Islamic fundamentalism in certain other parts of the world, Islamic fundamentalism. In the summer of 2009, the disputed presidential election in the Islamic Republic of Iran, in which I followed with some interest, because I have personal connections with the country, was making international headlines, and there were many stories about the arrest of innocent protesters and democratic opposition members, their torture in prison, and subsequent show trials and public confessions on Iranian TV of plotting with Westerners against the regime. The most prominent of the accused were previous stalwarts of the regime. At this time, Ramin Jahanbegloo, a prominent Iranian exile who earlier had spent some time in an Iranian prison, gave a talk in Toronto comparing the ideological and political situation in Iran and the public show trials with the equally ideological regime which had once existed in the Soviet Union under Stalin, and the famous Moscow show trials of 1937, and the public confessions of prominent communists who were later executed. Knowing that a culture of political jokes had arisen in Iran under the Islamists, similar to the one that had once existed in Eastern Europe under the communists, red humor it is sometimes called, I at that time sent the following email to my Iranian-Canadian colleague. And being an email, it has a subject. The subject was Genghis Khan. Dear Rami, in the late 1940s, the USSR claimed that it invented everything worth inventing in the world. Joseph Stalin received a report that a team of Soviet archaeologists in Central Asia had discovered a mummy, and it might be the remains of the great warrior Genghis Khan, who had conquered North China, Central Asia, and Khorasan, including Samarkand and Bukhara. Stalin was excited, but was told that he had to wait before the report could be confirmed. Stalin cabled the archaeologists. Patience has run out. Need report now. The next day he received a report that said that the mummy was indeed that of Genghis Khan. Stalin was delighted, and the discovery was immediately heralded all over the Soviet Union. The team of archaeologists was later given an official banquet and honors. At the banquet, another archaeologist was asked how the team was able to determine, without any doubt, within such a short time, that the mummy was indeed the remains of the great Genghis Khan. It was simple, replied one of the archaeologists. The mummy confessed. Subsequently, one of my Ukrainian studies colleagues, a connoisseur of such materials, Andrei Makuk of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Toronto office, remarked that this was an example of black humor as well as red humor. He did not have the ethnic meaning of black in mind. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Prymak, especially for keeping to time, which means that we can actually have 5 minutes for questions and a bit of a discussion. So I will open the floor to questions. Proszę pytanie.
How difficult is it to find examples of this? Were they published other than that book that you mentioned in '86?
Yes, this is an important one. May I stand over there?
There's room for us.
That's an important question. The sources. Where do you get this material? First of all, I said in my talk there's no scholarship on the subject. Absolutely none. There are a few collections of materials. The one I mentioned is the only one with several genres in it. You know, proverbs, folk songs, all these things. There are others, of course. There are books, for example, on communist jokes. There are many books on communist jokes. The name of one I can think of is called, right off the bat, it's called Hammer and Tickle. But there are many others as well. John Kolaski produced a book on communist jokes of Ukrainian origin. And John Robert Colombo, the famous Canadian folklorist, has produced a book called Red Humor. It's come out already. It's in the 4th edition now. And every edition he's added more and more and more. And I submitted my paper to him a couple of years ago, and he read it, and he said, well, I've got all this stuff already. So there's plenty of it. There's also lots of raw material that's never been studied, published but never been studied. For example, there was an old magazine called List Makita, filled with jokes. Every issue was filled with jokes. And other sources as well. So the situation is lots of material, no scholarship.
I have to do this, Thomas. This joke is going to be lost to the mists of time if I don't understand it. Imagine this is in the political science department in the University of Toronto in the early 1970s. It was written on a washroom wall. Large letters, Free Soviet Jews, underneath the small letters in every box of Post cereal.
Any other questions? Jokes?
Remember, folklore is not just jokes. There are all these other things too. There's riddles, puzzles, maxims, proverbs, all that. All of this is folklore. And I just mentioned a few examples of a few genres in this paper.
You mentioned this is coming out in the 4th.
Oh yes, and I should also mention that this particular paper is a chapter of a book I've got coming out. It's a book primarily of a memoristic nature, of the history of my search for my ancestral roots in Eastern Europe, and my experience in studying Ukrainian things and in Slavonic studies during the Cold War. As all of you know, this was a period of great tension in this area. Not only were there the regular politics going on within the university, but beyond that there was the international Cold War going on. So there are lots of interesting things about that, and I've tried to collect them all in this book. This paper recounts what I experienced, what I heard over the years. I didn't systematically sit down to study this. It just popped up. This here, that there. And so I put it together and it forms one chapter of this book.
Thank you, Dr. Prymak.